A billionaire CEO boarded a plane expecting a quiet flight until he found a woman and child asleep in his seat and realized the woman was his ex, and the child looked just like him. Julian Reed boarded the plane like any other day, phone in hand, mind wrapped in business meetings and market numbers, barely aware of his surroundings. He was supposed to be flying from Los Angeles to Boston for an important board presentation, and this private jet was his sanctuary, a rare few hours of quiet before the next round of decisions and deadlines. As he stepped into the cabin, his assistant had told him someone had mistakenly taken his seat. Julian didn't pay much attention at first. Mistakes happened all the time. But when he looked up to address the situation, expecting a flustered executive or a confused passenger, he stopped dead in his tracks. In the window seat, curled up, was a young woman, her blonde hair mussed from travel, her head resting lightly against the seat cushion. In her arms lay a sleeping child, no older than 4, nestled under a soft, worn blanket. Her small hand was clutched to the edge of her mother's sweater, and her legs were tucked up, as if she was trying to disappear into her warmth. The moment felt suspended in time. Julian's breath caught in his throat, not because a stranger had taken his seat, but because the woman asleep before him was no stranger at all. Isabella Diaz. He hadn't seen her in 4 years, not since he ended things in a whirlwind of ambition and self-justified logic. She had been the only person who had ever understood him, the only one who had seen the man underneath the titles and investments, and he had let her go without a second glance. Now, here she was, sleeping, on his flight, with a child. His eyes shifted back to the little girl, blonde like Isabella, delicate features. But then he saw something he wasn't prepared for. Eyes, though closed now, that he somehow knew were brown. His color, the color of his mother. He stood there longer than he should have, stunned. The flight attendant whispered if he should wake them, but he shook his head silently. Something told him this wasn't the time to cause a scene or demand his seat back. So he sat quietly across the aisle, resting his hands on his knees, still not quite convinced this wasn't a dream playing tricks on him after too many sleepless nights. He didn't know why Isabella was here, or how she ended up on this particular flight. He didn't know who the little girl was, though his instincts whispered louder with every breath. But one thing was for certain. This encounter was not random. It couldn't be. Not after all these years. Not after all that was left unsaid. So he waited, and he watched, and he wondered what kind of world he was about to step into once their eyes finally opened. Isabella stirred slowly as the soft hum of the jet engines blended with the faint clinking of glassware from the cabin crew. Her neck ached slightly from the angle she'd been sleeping in, and as she blinked her eyes open, she instinctively looked at her daughter to make sure she was still sleeping soundly. The child, curled in her lap, hadn't moved much. She was still clutching Isabella's sweater with a tiny fist, her head resting comfortably on Isabella's arm. Isabella brushed a few strands of hair off the little girl's forehead and let her eyes rise to her surroundings, expecting to be alone or surrounded by strangers she'd never talked to. But instead, she found herself meeting the gaze of someone she never thought she'd see again. Julian. The breath caught in her throat before she could stop it. For a moment, she thought maybe she was dreaming. Maybe her exhausted mind had conjured his face from some deep, forgotten memory. But it wasn't a dream. He was right there, sitting across from her, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his dark brown hair still slightly tousled the way she remembered, and those same piercing brown eyes were watching her with an unreadable expression. She sat up straighter, her heart thudding in her chest. She felt exposed, as if she had been caught at the most vulnerable moment of her life. She opened her mouth to speak, maybe to apologize for taking the wrong seat, or to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come out. What could she possibly say to him after all this time? Julian leaned forward slightly, his voice soft, controlled. "Isabella," he said simply. That was it. Her name. It felt strange to hear it from him again. So many emotions ran through her at once: surprise, confusion, even a touch of shame at being found like this, tired and worn, with her daughter asleep in her lap. "I didn't know," he added in a quiet voice. "You'd be here." She managed to nod slightly, running her hand down her daughter's back protectively. "I didn't either," she finally whispered. "It was a standby seat. We just needed to get home." She didn't elaborate on what home meant anymore. She wasn't even sure herself these days. Julian looked at the little girl again, his eyes lingering for a moment too long. "Is she yours?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Isabella's jaw tightened slightly, and she nodded again. "Her name is Chloe." She gave no further details. She didn't know him that much, not anymore. There was silence after that, thick and strange, filled with all the things they weren't saying. Isabella could see the questions in his eyes, feel the tension behind his calm exterior. But what surprised her most was that he didn't look angry or accusatory. He just looked hurt, confused, like a man trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't known was missing. She turned her face away, looking out the small oval window at the endless clouds below, her fingers tracing circles absently on Chloe's back. For 4 years, she had imagined what it would be like to run into Julian again. She never thought it would be like this, on a plane, with her daughter in her arms, and no escape from the conversation they both knew was coming. Julian couldn't take his eyes off the little girl sleeping peacefully in Isabella's arms. There was something about her face, her delicate features, the way her brows arched when she stirred, even the slight curve of her mouth, that struck him like a memory he couldn't quite place. But it wasn't just her resemblance to Isabella that drew him in. It was the unmistakable familiarity, the reflection of someone else, of himself. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who praised him, mimicked him, even feared him. But no one had ever looked so much like him. Not until now. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Isabella, is she mine?" The words dropped into the space between them like a weight, making her flinch ever so subtly. She didn't answer at first, and he could see her thinking, weighing something in her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but tired. "Yes." One word, heavy, undeniable, real. Julian felt something shift in his chest, as if all the air had been sucked out of the cabin. He had prepared himself for 1,000 possible truths, but to hear it confirmed was like being struck with a force he couldn't describe. Isabella looked down at Chloe, running a hand through her hair. "I found out I was pregnant just a few weeks after you left," she said, her voice low. "At first I thought about calling you, but then I remembered how you walked away without a second glance. You said you weren't ready for a family, for distractions. You had your life mapped out, and I didn't want to be a burden on that plan." She wasn't being cruel, just honest. Julian heard her words, but he was trapped in his own mind, replaying memories, trying to fit this child into the empty years of his life. He thought about where he was 4 years ago, how obsessed he had been with expanding deals, mergers, a seat at the top. He remembered thinking that anything soft or emotional or unpredictable would only hold him back. But now, faced with this truth, all those accomplishments felt hollow. "I had a right to know," he said, not with anger, but with pain. Isabella looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Maybe, But I had a right to protect her, too, she replied, and to protect myself. Her words were not an accusation, but a quiet defense of choices she never wanted to make alone. Julian nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to admit. Chloe stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, and then nestled deeper into her mother's arms. Julian's gaze softened. "She's beautiful," he said, almost to himself. "She's tough," Isabella replied, a hint of a proud smile touching her lips. "And smart, and stubborn, just like someone I used to know." They sat like that for a while, two people who once shared everything, now separated by years of silence and a child neither of them had expected. The hum of the engines filled the quiet between the still unsaid questions. Julian wanted to know everything: what Chloe liked, what she was afraid of, if she smiled in the morning or cried when it rained. He felt desperate to catch up on a life he hadn't known he was missing, but for now, he said nothing more. There would be time, or at least he hoped so, because even though his life had been filled with wealth and power, nothing had ever felt as real as the sleeping child across from him and the woman he once loved, who never stopped carrying the weight he had left behind. The plane began its descent into Boston, and the gentle chime of the seatbelt sign startled Isabella slightly. She shifted in her seat, gently adjusting Chloe so the little girl wouldn't wake up too abruptly. The reality of the moment was finally beginning to sink in. Not just the fact that she had accidentally ended up in Julian's seat, but that she had been found in a way she had carefully avoided for 4 years. Isabella could feel her heart thrumming, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of all that had been left unsaid for too long. Julian hadn't said much since her quiet confirmation that Chloe was his daughter, but his silence wasn't cold or angry. It was heavy with thought. He kept looking at Therem when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze flickering between Chloe's sleeping face and Isabella's profile. Isabella knew that look. It was the same one he used to get when he was trying to solve an impossible business puzzle, as if something fragile and vital was just out of his reach, and he was afraid of breaking it by reaching for it too quickly. When the wheels touched down, Julian finally spoke. "Where are you staying?" His voice was soft, unsure. Isabella hesitated, then answered truthfully. "Just a motel in Quincy, not far from the hospital." He looked at her closely, processing her words. "The hospital?" She nodded, running a hand down Chloe's back as the child began to stir. "She's had a respiratory condition since she was born. Sometimes she needs treatment we can't get locally. We come here every few months when it gets bad." She said it calmly, but there was a tremor beneath the surface, as if she had grown used to saying difficult things without letting them show. Julian's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. The thought that his daughter had been sick, suffering, and he hadn't known, hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about loss. Loss of time, of memories he could never get back. But more than that, it was about urgency. He wanted to do something, anything, to make it better. "Is she okay now?" he asked softly. Isabella nodded slowly. "She's stable, but it's always a concern, and I'm always scared when we travel." She didn't say it for pity. She said it because it was the truth. When the plane came to a halt, Chloe blinked her eyes open, confused by the sudden change. Isabella leaned down and whispered reassuring words in her ear. The little girl looked up, sleepy and dazed, then noticed Julian. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she stared at him with curiosity. He smiled, unsure of what to say, unsure if he should say anything at all. Isabella reached into her bag and pulled out a small stuffed bunny, handing it to Chloe, who clutched it instantly. Julian stood up and offered to help with their bags, and though Isabella resisted at first out of habit, She finally let him take the heaviest one. As they stepped out of the plane and onto the tarmac, the Boston air was cool and overcast. Isabella shivered slightly. Julian took off his jacket without a word and placed it over her shoulders, then turned and offered his hand to Chloe. She looked at him with wide eyes, then slowly took it. It was a small gesture, but it almost undid him. Outside the terminal, a taxi was already waiting. Isabella started to thank him and say goodbye, but Julian interrupted her gently. "Let me drive you. I have a car." She hesitated, looking at Chloe, then back at him. He added, "Please, I'm not asking for anything. I want to be around her, even for a little while longer." The honesty in his voice broke the guard she had built, and she nodded. The car ride was silent. Chloe eventually fell back asleep with her head in Isabella's lap, and Julian drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white. At a red light, he spoke without looking at her. "Do you hate me?" The question was raw and abrupt. Isabella looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No, I don't hate you, Julian. I stopped expecting." It wasn't an attack. It was just how it had been. And in some ways, that hurt him more. When they reached the motel, Isabella got out slowly. Julian followed her, leaving the bag near the door. Before she went inside, she turned to him. "You can stop by tomorrow if you want. Chloe might like to see you again. I think she already feels something." Julian nodded, the words caught in his throat. As she disappeared into the small building with Chloe in her arms, he stood there for a long time, watching them, feeling for the first time in years that his life was no longer entirely his own. And somehow that thought didn't scare him at all. The next morning, Julian found himself awake before sunrise, something that hadn't happened in years without an alarm or a business call dragging him out of bed. But this time, it wasn't anxiety or responsibility pulling him from sleep. It was a strange anticipation, mixed with a quiet guilt that had taken root the night before. He hadn't stopped thinking about Chloe, about the way her small hand had rested in his without hesitation, as if her instinct had already recognized something that had taken him 4 years to understand. She didn't know him, but she hadn't feared him either. That, more than anything, made him want to try. He spent most of the morning pacing. He wasn't sure what the right time to visit was. He didn't want to seem too eager, but the thought of waiting another day felt unbearable. By 10:30, he was parked outside the modest motel, holding a small paper bag with pastries and fresh fruit he'd picked up from a bakery he thought Chloe might like. He had never shopped for a child before, had no idea what she preferred, but he figured sweetness was a good place to start. Still, his hand shook slightly as he tapped on the door. Isabella opened it after a few seconds, her expression neutral, but not cold. She had clearly been up for a while. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun. She looked tired, but not fragile. In fact, there was a kind of strength to her posture now that hadn't been there when they were younger. She didn't say much at first, just nodded and stepped aside to let him in. The room was small and simple, a double bed in the center, and a small table by the window where Chloe was coloring quietly, her legs dangling beneath the chair. She looked up when Julian entered, her eyes lighting up with a recognition that startled him. "Hi," she said shyly, clutching a crayon. "Hi, Chloe," he replied softly, stooping down a little so he didn't tower over her. "I brought breakfast if you're hungry." She looked at Isabella for silent permission, and when her mother nodded, Chloe smiled and said, "Okay," hopping down from the chair. They sat together at the table, Julian watching as Chloe chose a croissant and carefully broke it into small pieces. She ate slowly, without making a mess, with the kind of care that suggested she had been taught to make food last. Every small gesture from her told him something new. How she looked at Isabella before answering questions, How she held her crayon in her left hand just like him. How she asked him if he had a bunny, too, when she pulled her stuffed animal out and placed it proudly in his lap. Isabella mostly watched at first, unsure what to expect from the man who had once faded away so easily. But Julian didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't boast or overcompensate. He just stayed present. He asked Chloe what she liked to draw, what her favorite cartoon was, what kind of music she liked. When she told him she liked to sing, he asked her if she would one day sing for him. She nodded without hesitation. That nod undid him more than any apology ever could have. After a while, Isabella excused herself to take a phone call from the hospital, and Julian and Chloe were left alone. She showed him her sketchbook, turning page after page with enthusiasm, narrating each drawing with the clarity of someone who had created a whole world inside her head. One drawing in particular made him pause. It was of a house with 3 windows and 3 stick figures. One was her. One, he assumed, was Isabella. And the third one had brown hair and was labeled Maybe Daddy. He stared at it longer than he should have, and when he looked up, Chloe was watching him carefully. "Is that you?" she asked, tilting her head. Julian nodded slowly. "I think it might be." She smiled at him, and it wasn't a big smile, but it was the kind of smile that felt like a door opening. When Isabella came back, Julian stood and gently handed her a folded note he had written while she wasn't looking. "You don't have to read it now," he said to Isabella, "but I wanted to say everything I never said before, and everything I didn't know how to say last night." She nodded and took it without a word. As Julian left the motel room that day, the weight in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt like something was beginning, not because he deserved it, but because he was finally choosing to fight for it. Isabella didn't open the letter right away. She kept it in her pocket all afternoon as she took Chloe to her hospital appointment, answered doctors' questions, and held her daughter's hand through the same tests they had done too many times before. But that night, after Chloe had fallen asleep beside her with her bunny tucked under her chin and the blanket pulled up to her nose, Isabella sat by the dim motel lamp and slowly unfolded the paper. Julian's handwriting hadn't changed. It was still slightly slanted, with sharp lines and a certain rhythm to the letters. She read the first few lines twice before her heart caught up with the words. He hadn't written a formal apology. Instead, he had written with honesty. He told her how lost he had felt for years without knowing it, how he had tried to fill the silence with power and progress, how everything he thought mattered had suddenly felt meaningless the moment he saw Chloe's face. He bluntly admitted that he had been selfish back then, not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of caring too much. And in that fear, he had walked away from the only thing that had ever made him feel human. Isabella wiped her cheek once, then again, not realizing she was crying until the letter blurred. It wasn't just what he had written. It was the fact that she believed him. He had changed. She had seen it in his eyes, in the way he looked at Chloe, in how softly he moved through their fragile space, never pushing, never demanding, just present. She folded the letter and put it on the nightstand, then turned off the light and curled up next to her daughter, unsure of what the next day would bring, but no longer filled with dread. The next morning, Julian was there again. He tapped gently and waited with coffee for her and a small box wrapped in tissue paper for Chloe. This time, Isabella didn't hesitate. She opened the door and smiled. Chloe ran to him, her arms wrapping around his leg, as if she had been doing it her whole life. Isabella couldn't help but laugh through the tightness in her throat. They spent the day together, doing nothing spectacular, just walking through a quiet park, feeding birds, sitting on a bench, while Chloe played in the grass. Julian listened to Isabella more than he spoke. He asked her about her job, how she had managed all these years alone, how she had stayed so strong. She shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise, but finally admitted that it hadn't been easy. There were nights she had gone to bed crying, mornings she had to choose between food and medication, weeks she didn't know how they would make it. But she had always kept going, not because she had no other choice, but because Chloe was worth everything. Julian felt something inside him unravel as he listened. The life he had lived had never required that kind of courage. He had faced pressure and competition, yes, but not the kind of fear that came with being responsible for a small, fragile life without a safety net. He respected her in a way he couldn't put into words. That afternoon, as the sun dipped in the sky and the breeze picked up, Chloe climbed into Julian's lap and held his face in her small hands. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard. "If you want me to." She nodded once and rested her head against his chest. Isabella watched them with a mix of awe and fear. She hadn't expected this, not just his return, but his softness, his openness, his willingness to take every step carefully, as if he knew how easily trust could be broken. When they returned to the motel, Julian lingered at the door. "Isabella," he said in a low voice, "I don't want to leave again. I don't know what this means yet, or how it's supposed to work. But I know I want to be in her life, and in yours, if you'll let me." She didn't answer right away, just studied his face. Then, instead of replying with words, she opened the door and stepped aside. He followed her in, not as a man who had it all, but as one who had almost lost the only things that truly mattered. The weeks that followed unfolded slowly, like pages from a forgotten book that were finally being read again. Julian didn't rush. He showed up every morning at the motel, sometimes with breakfast, sometimes with just a smile and a gentle knock. Chloe greeted him as if she had known him her whole life, her arms wrapping around his legs, or her face lighting up as she pulled him inside. Isabella watched it all with cautious hope. She had spent so long building a world where she didn't rely on anyone, where it was just her and Chloe against everything. But now, someone else had entered that world, not by force, but by a quiet persistence. One afternoon, while Chloe was napping, Julian and Isabella sat outside on the small bench near the motel parking lot. The air was warm, but the shadows were long, and the breeze smelled vaguely of spring. Isabella sipped from a paper cup and looked across the street. "You're not the same person," she said in a quiet voice, not looking at him. "You used to be so controlled, cold, focused like a machine." Julian laughed under his breath, not from offense, but from recognition. "I thought that's how success worked," he said. "Keep your head down. Keep your heart closed. Emotions were for people who could afford to be distracted." Isabella turned to him. "And now?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the motel room where Chloe was sleeping. "Now, I think success is having someone to miss when they're gone. Someone who waits for you. Someone whose smile actually changes something inside of you." Isabella didn't speak, but her eyes softened. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who left, but as the man who had finally come back with his eyes wide open. Later that night, they took Chloe to a small community fair. It wasn't fancy, just a few booths, some food stalls, and a carousel that had seen better days. But to Chloe, it was magic. She held both of their hands as they walked, her laughter echoing as she tasted cotton candy for the first time, and was amazed by a magician who pulled a coin from behind her ear. Isabella watched the way Julian carried her when her legs got tired, the way he let her choose the rides, and didn't care when she got chocolate on his shirt. She saw a father who needed no instructions, just instinct, the kind that had been buried but never truly lost. That night, back at the motel, Chloe fell asleep between them in the bed, exhausted and happy. Julian reclined in the chair next to them, watching her breathe, the soft rhythm almost meditative. Isabella looked at him and whispered, "She knows." He looked back at her, confused. "Knows what?" Isabella smiled softly. "She knows you're hers." She knew before I ever said it out loud. Julian looked at the little girl and then back at Isabella, his voice thick. "I wish I had known sooner." She reached over and took his hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise wrapped in perfection, but it was something stronger, a truth earned through pain, through growth, through time. They weren't just two people reconnecting. They were rebuilding something new. Not out of nostalgia, but out of the raw pieces of who they had become. And slowly, that felt like something worth holding on to. The months went on in quiet, but not meaningless stride. The small moments, the shared breakfasts, the bedtime stories, the walks through parks with Chloe skipping ahead, began to weave something strong and real between the three of them. The transition wasn't sudden, and it wasn't always easy. There were days when Isabella found herself retreating, fearing that too much happiness might collapse under the weight of expectation. There were also days when Julian doubted himself, unsure if he could ever make up for all the time he had lost. But through it all, they stayed. And staying, they learned, was more powerful than grand gestures. Chloe adjusted quicker than either of them expected. She asked questions when she needed to, but mostly, she accepted Julian, the way children accept love, without suspicion, without demand, just with open hands and honest eyes. She began calling him Daddy one night while showing him a drawing she had made at school, and the word hung in the air like a blessing. Julian froze when he heard it, his eyes wide, his breath held. But he didn't correct her. He just hugged her and held her like he had been waiting years to earn that small word. Finally, Julian suggested they move out of the motel. He didn't push or pressure. He simply said, "You both deserve better than this," and showed Isabella a nearby apartment, simple, sun-filled, with a second bedroom for Chloe and a small balcony with room for a flower box. Isabella had hesitated, but Chloe had danced through the empty rooms as if they were made of gold. They moved in 2 weeks later. Isabella kept her job at the small bookstore around the corner, and Julian visited daily, even when his schedule was tight. He made the time now, because he finally understood that time was all he had to give that truly mattered. One night, just before Chloe's 5th birthday, Julian invited them for dinner, not at a grand restaurant, but at his home. He cooked for them himself, clumsily but with sincerity, and over slightly burnt pasta and over-salted garlic bread, he told them he had made a decision. He was stepping back from the day-to-day operations of his company. He wasn't retiring, just pulling back. "I missed 4 years," he said, his voice quiet. "I won't miss another one." Isabella hadn't expected it. She stared at him, tears in her eyes, because for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone had chosen them completely, not in moments, not in pieces, but whole. That night, Chloe fell asleep on the couch with her bunny in her arms, and Julian and Isabella sat next to her in the soft quiet of the living room. He reached for Isabella's hand, and she let him take it. There was no declaration, no dramatic finale, just the sound of breathing, the weight of peace. They had all been broken once, by pride, by fear, by time. But sitting there, they no longer felt like fragments. They felt whole, together. When Julian put Chloe to bed that night, she murmured sleepily, "Are you staying?" He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Always," he whispered. Isabella stood in the doorway, watching them with a quiet smile. And in that moment, she realized something had changed, not just in Julian, but in her. She no longer felt like she was carrying the world alone. For the first time in years, the future didn't scare her. It felt wide and soft and good. And as the lights dimmed and the city hummed outside, they walked into it, hand in hand, heart to heart, ready for whatever came next. Not perfect, but together. And that, finally, was enough.